going on, everybody? It's Joe, and welcome back to another episode of Sleeper Sunday. Sleeper Sunday, for those of you that don't know, is a series I came up with showcasing fun hidden decks you may not know about that can deal quite a bit of damage in the proper hands. We'll be going over a basic deck list, strengths, weaknesses, what can be done to make the deck better, and of course, a few replays to see the deck in action. In today's episode, we're going to be going over the winner of this month's poll, Fluffal. Fluffal is an archetype of mostly Earth Fairy monsters released in the new Challengers back in November of 2014, with their most recent direct support being in Rise of the Duelist in August of 2020. However, this is only in regards to the Fluffal archetype itself, as Fluffal is actually a part of a trio of working archetypes, the others being Edge Imp, comprised of Dark Fiends, and Frightfurs, who are, well, also mostly Dark Fiends. With this taken into account, their most recent support is technically out of Brothers of Legend back in December of 2021, being Toy Parade, which is always treated as a Frightfur, despite vaguely supporting the stuff. They have a fusion-based extra deck with their only real gimmick in their playstyle being the very aggressive amount of removal and raw damage output, designed to OTK the opponent as fast as possible when the deck is played pure. Aesthetically, the gimmick revolves around these cute stuffed animal Fluffal monsters being fused with the Edge Imps, which are mostly made up of sharp objects, tools, and weapons, to create a sort of a nightmarish version of the former. This gimmick played along well with Sora Shiunin, or Sora Purse in the dub, of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5 anime, who would use the cards and his cutesy attitude and appearance to catch his opponents off guard before showing his true colors. Also, unrelated to Fluffal as a whole, my man got robbed. In the anime, his own whole personality was like, fusion good, Xyz bad, but then the manga has him making a deal with a god in order to save his sick sister by reliving his life over and over until he can find a cure. Oh yeah, and his sister's like completely absent from the anime, by the way, and furthermore, so starting off with what's basically become the poster child of Fluffal at this point, despite being like a bit like halfway through the life cycle of the deck, is Fluffal Penguin. It's a level 4 water fairy. I know I did just say they're mostly earth fairies, but this is one of the exceptions, that says during your main phase you can special a Fluffal from your hand except Fluffal Penguin. This effect can only be used once while this is face up on the field, and if this card is sent to the graveyard as a fusion material for a fusion summon of a Frightfur, you can draw 2 cards and then discard 1 card, and this is a hard ones per turn. So this has become arguably the most important and the strongest card in the Fluffal arsenal, and it's mostly due to that first effect. So of course it says it can only be used once while it's face up on the field, however that basically means it's once per copy, and that includes when you reset it, such as reviving it from your graveyard, so you can easily make use of Penguin's effect 2, 3, 4 plus times per turn in order to get more Fluffals on board and to actually power out a lot of link material or Xyz fodder. The second effect is also really strong because, you're already going to be fusing it off anyway most of the time if you're not overlaying it, so being able to draw 2 and then discard 1 in an archetype that has quite a few actually really solid graveyard-based effects, such as Edge Imp Chain, Edge Imp Sabers, or even non-Fluffal cards such as Eldritch and Tier Limits Merly, you have a lot of different cards that would really benefit being in the graveyard off of this, and it just helps you dig even further through your deck for more extenders to make your massive board. Next up is one of the classic Fluffal monsters, Fluffal Dog. It says on normal or special summon from the hand, you can add an Edge Imp Sabers or Fluffal from deck except Dog, and it's a hard ones per turn. Dog is a very simple card, actually very decent stats on it. It's basically just a Stratos. It is a little unfortunate that it only works on someone from the hand. A few of the Fluffals do that for some reason. I guess it's like some kind of little hindrance, but most of them, like the newer ones, don't really have that restriction. But it usually doesn't come out too much anyway, and you can easily summon this off of Penguin most of the time. Next up is basically the classic Fluffal monster, being Fluffal Bear, which we're only playing 2 copies of. It is a level 3 Earth Fairy that it says you can send it from the hand to the graveyard to set a toy vendor directly from your deck to your spell and trap zone, and you contribute it to add a polymerization from grave to hand, but it's a 1 effect per turn, and you're typically never using that second effect. So in order for Bear to make the most sense, it'd probably provide a lot of context to explain what Toy Vendor does. Toy Vendor is a continuous spell that says once per turn you can discard 1 card, draw 1 card and show it, then if it's a Fluffal you can special a monster from your hand, otherwise discard it, and if this card is sent to the graveyard you can add an Edge Imp Sabers or Fluffal monster from your deck to your hand. Note the lack of a hard ones per turn on this card. Basically, the entire deck lives and breathes around using and abusing the Toy Vendor as many times as possible for both draw power and for the search power it provides. You have plenty of ways of putting this into the graveyard and sending it directly to your field, such as the Fluffal Bear and another Fluffal we'll talk about in a second that can reset it from your graveyard to use it again, which makes cards like Foolish Burial Goods a very strong inclusion in the deck. It's really funny too, because back then, when Fluffal was like a very new archetype, you even had YouTubers that are kind of iconic for Fluffal at this point, such as Dazif, saying, this card sucks. It's absolutely horrible. It's like almost impossible, except with Edgem Sabers, to guarantee you'll get a Fluffal off the top. You're discarding stuff for no reason. You're not really getting enough resources. It's complete dog shit. And now it's easily the strongest card in the deck, and even without stacking, there's just a lot of really strong Fluffal targets. That means either you're going to discard a card and get graveyard set up anyway, or you're going to get a free special summon, which can include things like Penguin or Dog, or some of the other cool Fluffals with on-summon effects that we will talk about in a moment. Speaking of, we have Fluffal Octo. It's actually Fluffal Octopus now. I think it was just Octo back in the translation, but it is a level 1 Water Fairy with 800 attack and defense. It says on summon, you can target a Fluffal or Edgem in your grave and add it to your hand, and if it's sent to the graveyard as fusion material for the summon of a Frightfur, you can target up to 2 of your banished monsters and return them to the graveyard. So Octo basically is really good at like recursion. You get to just add it off a toy vendor or something if you need an extra target to grab, and you can just get your stuff back from your graveyard, which is really strong for things like Penguin in order to re-loop its draw effect or its summon effect if you can summon it from hand as well, or even things like Fluffal Sheep, which we will talk about in a moment. And the second effect, while it doesn't come out too often, is mostly here for Fluffal Wings. Fluffal Wings is a level 1 Light Fairy that says if it's in your graveyard and you control Toy Vendor, you can banish this card from your graveyard and target a Fluffal in your graveyard. Banish it, and if you do draw a card, then you may send a Toy Vendor you control to the graveyard, and if you do, draw another card. This card is ridiculous, and almost any other deck would kill for something like this. Wings is basically one of your be-all, end-all, like, consistency pieces, being able to be a +3 in, like, basically, because you get to draw 2 cards, and you get to trigger your Toy Vendor to search. Not to mention anything you might have done with the Toy Vendor previously, but you can like discard a card, such as the Wings, draw a card, get some advantage off of that, and then use the Wings to get rid of it, and then be able to just search a bunch of stuff. You can swarm the board super easy with all the new resources you have in your hand, and it's just absolutely ridiculous. One of the most important cards in the deck, and Octo is essentially there to put it back, though you really don't need to resolve it more than once typically. Next is Fluffal Owl. This is kind of a personal inclusion. It's typically not like a super common card to see in Fluffal anymore, but it's a level 2 Earth Fairy that says on summon from the hand, you can add a Polymerization from your deck to your hand, and you can pay 500 life points to fusion summon a Frightfur using monsters from your hand or field as fusion materials. Owl is just an extra way to get some fusion bodies on board in case you don't have access to your Frightfur Patchwork or, you know, any other sort of polymerization engine. Either it can add poly from your deck, or in case you run out of polys, which actually is fairly common admittedly in this deck in the grind game, you can just pay 500 life points to fuse anyway. Again, it's not like a super commonly played card in the deck anymore. It was back then, like a lot, like it was a 2 of, but now Owl is kind of like a, you can play it if you want to, but it's not really a super mandatory card. I just personally really enjoy it. Next up we have Fluffal Sheep, another level 2 Earth Fairy that says if you control a Fluffal except Sheep, you can special it from your hand as an inherent summon. Then you can return another Fluffal you control to the hand to special an Edgem from your hand or graveyard, and you can only use this effect as Sheep once per turn. Sheep is a really good free body that you can get on board to easily loop cards like your Penguin or a follow-up Dog, or if you will, while not really getting rid of any extra bodies. So basically you can get one of your Fluffals back. Again, especially Penguin is really good to have on your opponent's turn for a card we'll mention later, but then you can just replace it with an Edgem from your graveyard, so you're kind of just getting free value out of that, and it's especially good with things like Edgem Chain, which will trigger if it's sent to the graveyard, or Edgem Sabers in case you have a poly and want to fuse into your Tiger that requires it. Other than that though, it's just a pretty solid extender, especially being an inherent summon, so you can get an extra body on board without baiting your opponent too hard. One of their more new cards out of Rise of the Duelist is Fluffal Dolphin, and this card just kind of changed the entirety of the archetype. So Fluffal Dolphin is a level 4 Water Fairy that says you can target a Toy Vendor in your graveyard, set it, and if you do, send a Fluffal or Edgem Sabers from your deck to the graveyard. Also, it's sent to the graveyard as fusion material for any fusion summon. You can shuffle into the deck one fusion spell or polymerization that is banished or in your graveyard back into the deck, and you can only use each effect once per turn. This card did so much for the archetype. So not only is it a really easy way to reset your Toy Vendor and use it again, it also immediately sends the Wings directly to the graveyard so that you have that extra setup, but it's also a level 4 water, meaning that you can use Penguin to summon it, use its effect to dump Wings, reset Toy Vendor, and then go into Bahamut Shark, Bahamut summon Toad, and now you have a second Fluffal in your graveyard in order to activate your Wings effect, as well as having an Omni Negate so that your opponent can't use something like an Ash Blossom on your Wings. You'd think for such a strong card you'd be playing more than one copy, and I've seen some lists play two. Typically back when Penguin was played at 2 as well, you'd go like 2-2, but I think one Dolphin is more than enough. You have enough ways to search it, especially off of Foolish Burial Goods, which pairs perfectly with the card, by the way, considering you can just immediately reset the vendor you just dumped. And I also just want to point out, look at him, he's just a little guy. That's it for the Fluffals. Finally moving on to the Edgeimps, we have 3 copies of Chain. So Chain is a level 4 Dark Fiend that says when it declares an attack, you can add an Edgeimp Chain from your deck to your hand. This effect is never going to come up ever, so just ignore the fact that I said it. Also, it's sent from the hand or field to the graveyard. You can add a Frightfur card from your deck to your hand. Chain is a really solid card because a lot of the really good Fluffals, or Frightfurs I should say actually, at this point require just generic materials, so it's not like Chain is like super restrictive like it used to be for things like, you know, Frightfur Sheep, I think exactly. And now it just serves as a really good consistency piece. You have many ways to get it out of your hand or field, things like Toy Vendor of course is the big one, and then you can also just fuse it off as well, or even link it off in the case of something like Fluffal Sheep, and so you can get your free Frightfur cards directly from your deck, which is really good because they have some pretty strong Frightfur cards in the deck. I was tinkering around with like 2 copies of this at some point, and it's definitely not like the worst thing ever, but I felt I wasn't seeing enough Edgeimps because not seeing any Edgeimps is pretty rough when you kind of need them for half your fusion summon. Their most recent Edgeimp is Edgeimp Scythe. It's a level 3 that says during your opponent's main phase quick effect, you can reveal this card in your hand to fusion summon a Frightfur from your extra deck using monsters from your hand or field, including this card in your hand. If a Frightfur fusion you control be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can banish this card from your graveyard instead. Scythe is so good. This card basically made Fluffal like an actual threat for once, after like years of being completely dormant, because this was one of the first examples of like a turn 0 play. Believe it or not, before Tyr was using Havness to go full combo on your turn, Scythe was fusing with Penguin on the opponent's turn to draw into hand traps and pop a card with Whale. The protection's also really good with the aforementioned Whale, which we will get to when we get to the extra deck of course, and it's just an overall very solid card. The only downside to Scythe is that you have to use it as material and it's only treated as itself. There are a few really strong ones such as Tiger of course that would love it to be treated as sabers or allow you to at least fuse with the sabers in your hand, but otherwise it's still a very solid card. Allowing yourself to just play on your opponent's turn before they can even play is really solid in this game, and also you can just use it even when you are going first. You can just have it in your hand, which is a very common play. And the final Edgeimp is the classic Edgeimp Sabers out of the very first wave of support. It's a level 3 that says if it's in your graveyard, you can place a card from your hand on top of the deck to special this card in defense position, and you can only use this effect once per turn. Honestly, not like the best effect, but it's also not the worst effect in an era where Link monsters are really good. It's not like you're using Tour Guide to get it directly out of the deck anymore, though, at least. But you have many ways to search this. You have things like Toy Vendor, you got your Frightfur Patchwork, you have your Dolphin that can dump it, you have Dog that can search it. It's basically the most searchable one because it was the only one for the longest time, and so it's a pretty solid card, especially because it can help you go into Frightfur Tiger, which is massive. We are playing a couple of non-Fluffal or Edgeimp monsters to help supplement the deck. Eldritch the Golden Lord is an absolutely massive one. So remember Toy Vendor? That's all I really need to say. So Golden Lord allows you to get some really good removal in the deck without having to go into your extra deck first. It's also just a free way to put Toy Vendor in your graveyard. You can get it out of your hand, you can get it off of your field, and you can just get a massive 3500 indestructible body that you can slap down and either punch with or use as link fodder. And it's just mainly there to trigger Toy Vendor, honestly. I don't know why I'm babbling anymore. And we're also playing one copy of Merly, so Merly's a bit of an interesting card in the deck because you're not using it for the mill or anything, even though I guess it can hit a Toy Vendor, but you're definitely using it for the fusion effect. So you do have to use the Merly for the fusion summon, which is a bit of a downside, quote unquote, but it's very, very strong in combination with the Frightfur Whale, because you can easily use the Whale and the Cross Sheep. I'm just saying the combo a little bit early, but use Whale and Cross Sheep or any other way to go into Sprind. Sprind dumps Merly, and you fuse the Merly off with the Whale in order to make something like a Dragastapelia. Basically just gives you a free disruption without even having to try, and you can even send it to the graveyard off of the Toy Vendor, not the initial discard, but off of the draw card, reveal it, and then send it to the grave if it's not a Fluffal, or you can send it off of the Penguin discard, etc. The final monster in the deck is 3 copies of Orange Light. Honestly not the most necessary card, but I find it to be pretty solid considering you can't really play too many other hand traps super reliably. You have to play really high impact ones if you do play hand traps, otherwise they're just going to get pitched off Toy Vendor anyway. And Orange Light is a very strong hand trap you can play in the deck, especially especially when you open it in combination with something like Wings, because then you can just get the Wings in graveyard and negate and destroy something, which is pretty cool. I already talked about Toy Vendor and Foolish Burial Goods. Let's talk about Fright for Patchwork. Believe it or not, this is a Fluffal card. This isn't just a grab chain, grab poly, make Guardian Chimera engine for Despia, or Chimera or anything. This is actually a Fluffal card, and it's by far one of the most important cards in the entire deck. Add an Edge Imp, add a Poly. This was the card that kind of kept Fluffal from being like really good for the longest time, because Patchwork took so long to get imported from the OCG into the TCG. I think it was revealed in like 2016, and we didn't get it until Soul Fusion in 2018, when there was plenty of opportunities for Fluffal to actually be a decent deck if it got imported in time. I know it was actually like okay during Zoo format, because fun fact, Fright for Sheep was insane against Zoo. If they popped it with Dryden, it came back and became really big, and then they couldn't use the Whiptail and the damage step to get rid of it because it has the Armades effect. So maybe if we got Patchwork back then, this deck would have saw more meta success, but you know, at least we did end up getting it eventually in Soul Fusion, and it's a really good card, of course. This kind of just kickstarts a lot of your plays. And then of course 2 Polymerization off of the Patchwork and the Owl. Didn't really feel like I needed 3, it was a bit like clunky or anything, but you definitely want to play more than 1, and they don't have an archetypal fusion spell of their own, other than Fright for Fusion, which is just a Miracle Fusion. It's a Fright for Fusion monster from your extra deck by banishing materials from field or grave. Really strong card for accessing your Tiger, can access Whale in a pinch as well. Usually ends up getting discarded off Toy Vendor though from the draw one, discard it, because luck's just unfortunate like that. The final Fright for card is Fright for Repair. It says target a Fright for Fusion in your grave, return it to the extra deck, then you can special a Fluffal or Edge Imp from your graveyard, and you can banish it from your graveyard to special a Fluffal or Edge Imp from your hand. You can only use 1 effect per turn. The first effect almost never really comes up. You don't really want the Repair to stay in your hand. The graveyard effect is absolutely the best part of the card, being able to special your things like your Penguin, your Dog, your Dolphin, your Chain, even sometimes like, you know, your Octo or your Owl, just feels really, really good. Getting that extra Link fodder or Xyz fodder on the board. You can even use it to combine with Fright for Fusion in case you need that extra Fluffal monster from your hand on the board, so that you can make an even bigger pop on your Tiger, sorry. Just feels super solid, and you have plenty of ways to get in the graveyard from both the hand and from the deck. Also, this Called By is not supposed to be here, it's supposed to be at the very end, but I mean, hey, I guess you know that we're playing Called By. Royal Penguin's Garden is a bit of an interesting choice in the deck, because why the fuck are we playing a Penguin card in this deck? Well, it's probably the fact that it says you can add a Penguin card from your deck to the hand on activation. That's really like the big part of the card. It adds Fluffal Penguin, which is really funny, but I have actually gotten mileage out of the second effect, which says once per turn during your main phase, you can decrease the level of a Penguin monster in your hand or field by 1, and then discard 1 card. This has been used for me to trigger Edge Imp Chain. I've used it to put Wings in the graveyard, Sabers in the graveyard, and I think once I even put the Merly in the graveyard, which let me fusion summon, which was massive. Honestly, not even the worst set of effects, and at the end of the day, after you use it for everything you really need it for, you can just always send it off of your Forbidden Droplet, which is amazing in this deck because, of course, things like Chain, Wings, Toy Vendor, Repair, all these things that want to be in your graveyard, you can put in your graveyard. And then finally, outside of the Called By, we are playing 2 copies of Triple T. Not the most impactful card a lot of the time, but it does help you play through certain hand traps, and in one of the replays, it was absolutely massive at just completely obliterating a poor Ice Barrier player. That's it for the main deck. Moving on to the extra deck, we have 2 copies of Fright for Cruel Whale. Fun fact, this is actually the only Fright for monster that has its adjective, so all the original translations do have adjectives. You know, you got like Scissor Tiger, you have, God, what was Bears? I think it's whatever Edge Imp they were, so it's like Fright for Scissor Bear, Fright for Scissor Tiger, you had Scissor Wolf, you had Chain Sheep. I think the only one that was close to technically having an adjective was Sabertooth, which was Saber Tiger in the original. However, you really kind of needed Sabertooth in order to, like, actually say that it was a Sabertooth. So yeah, Fright for Cruel Whale is the only Fright for that actually kept its adjective, which was funny. But Whale is a level 9 Water Fiend fusion with 2600 attack, 2400 defense. It requires 1 Edge Imp and 1 Fluffal. Again, one of the more generic ones because it is one of the newer ones. That says on fusion summon, you can destroy 1 card on both players' fields. Once per turn, quick effect, you can target a fusion you control, send a Fright for card from your deck or extra to the graveyard except Whale, and if you do, the targeted monster gains attack equal to half its original attack until the end of the turn. Whale is just a really solid card overall. It's just got a lot of really good things going for it. really big stats. The level 9 helps in a thing I'll mention in a minute. Super generic summoning materials, non-target pop that can trigger things like your toy vendor, or you can just protect it with a scythe if you really need to. Graveyard setup for your Frightful Repair, or I guess technically a Frightful from your extra deck, but you're always going to dump the repair anyway. That can make your big things even bigger, and none of this is a hard once per turn. And I did mention that it was a level 9, which is really, really funny because after the wave of Rise of the Duel support came out that gave us Dolphin, Scythe, and Whale, Fluffal was actually really, really funny because King of All Calamities was not banned. So yeah, you could easily make 2 whales, pop things if you really needed to, and then just overlay them for a Calamities, which finally gave Fluffal a going first play for the longest time, which was super funny, and also super stupid, by the way. I love Calamities, but I do acknowledge that it is an absolute dog shit unfair card. But yeah, Fluffal was actually like super correct for a little bit until Calamities got banned. It just wasn't really experimented with enough in my opinion, but I think it was really, really funny to use Whale to lock people. The only other Fright for Fusion we are playing admittedly in the extra deck is 1 copy of Fright for Tiger. It's a level 6 Dark Fiend with 1900 attack and 1200 defense. It requires specifically Edgem Sabers and then 1 or more Fluffal monsters. That says when this card is fusion summoned, you can target cards in the field up to the number of fusion materials used for its summon and destroy them. All Fright for Fusion monsters you control gain 300 attack for each Fluffal monster and Fright for monster you control, and you can only control 1 Tiger. This card is just ridiculous, especially when you remember that Fright for Fusion is a card. So it's pretty clear why this is the only other Fright for we play, just because of how absolutely absurd it is. At the low cost of just having to use Sabers, which, ooh, big deal, it's super searchable anyway, you can nuke potentially any number of cards on the board, both boards by the way, so you can trigger Toy Vendor, as you just want. I think the most I've gotten to was 9, which was insane, and then also, after nuking that, all of your Frightfurs get 300 attack for each Fluffal and Frightfur you control, so bare minimum Tiger is going to be 22, not 19, and that again accounts for the Fluffals as well. So for example, you have a Tiger and a Whale on board, but you also have a Dog. The Dog doesn't get attack, which is fine, it's already 1700, but the Tiger and the Whale are going to get 900 extra attack, which is more than enough to push for game. Very, very strong card, and I still need to get around to Sun Bleaching one of mine. I've always wanted to Sun Bleach a card, and I think Tiger was the one I wanted to do. Those are the only Frightfurs we are playing, but we do play some generic fusions such as the Guardian Chimera. We're playing Polymerization, we might as well, honestly, especially because we are playing Patchwork. Really solid removal, big body, gets the targeting protection, and helps you dig for more stuff. And then we have the Dragastapelia for the exact combo I mentioned earlier with Merly, though you can also hard make it using Polymerization. Very strong card, one of my favorite fusion monsters of all time. Moving on to some Xyz monsters we do play, Abyss Dweller is very strong at locking down graveyards, but also you usually do get the 500 attack boost from using something like a Penguin or a Dolphin. And then of course, as I mentioned, you do have the Bahamut Toad play, super insanely strong, and Toad can also add back things like your Penguin after negating, so you can get some massive advantage off of that. And then Typhon is Typhon, not too much to explain there. We are also playing Cross Sheep. It's a crucial part of a lot of your combos. Getting that Penguin back from the graveyard after fusion summoning to its zone is really strong, so you can re-loop the Penguin's effect again. Sprint is here for the Merly play exactly, but I guess you could technically dump a Sheep or an Owl in case you need wings to go off. We are playing Dark so that we can climb into some more Link monsters. I think we were playing Access Code in here, so it was even better, but we are still playing IP and SP. IP is a good part of the end board, SP is also a good part of the end board if you make it with Dark. You can also IP into it, of course, and then we are playing Apo, which is usually a pretty common part of the board. So that's it for the actual deck list. On to some cards that you could play but don't, because Fluffal has a lot of cards. I'm not gonna permanently go through a lot of them, but I will mention a few notable ones. Fright for Meister, I don't remember exactly what it was played for. I forgot the exact fiend that was played in the deck. It was some really jank one. Actually, I think it was Lilith, Lady of Lament, so that you could grab Necrofusion, I believe. So yeah, this was back during the Skyhawk build, was when it was very first being innovated, because basically Fluffal's kind of just been completely identified around the Skyhawk build of going into Link plays and stuff like that for the longest time. But yeah, basically use Fright for Meister to tribute a level 3 thing from your main deck, and then you would tag out into Lilith. Lilith would grab Necrofusion. That way you could Necrofusion into Tiger on the opponent's turn and get some big pops going. It kind of just ended up becoming a bit too slow, too clunky in my opinion, especially. Plus you had to play the Lilith, you had to play the Meister, and then you had to play the 3 Necrofusions, which could all end up being bricks. Not really super great. Fluffal Leo is completely dog shit. Edgeum Saw is also not amazing. Fluffal Angel actually did see play back when it first came out, but it was another card that unfortunately got imported way too late for Fluffal. So the big problem with it was that it is a free monster reborn for a Fluffal or Edgeum in your grave, which is really, really good, but it locks you into fusion monsters from the extra, and this was really, really bad before Master Rule 4 2020 revision, back when you literally had to just keep going Sabretooth, Sabretooth, Sabretooth for this deck to actually function. But now it's not the worst thing ever, but you don't really play pure Fluffal like that anymore to where you're playing mostly fusions. The second effect would be better if we played more of the fusions though. Fluffal Cat and Rabbit aren't even bad cards, honestly. They both say if they're sent to the grave as fusion material for a fusion summon, you can add either a Poly or an Edgeum Sabers or Fluffal respectively from Cat and Rabbit. So I actually used to play Cat for the longest time. I played like a single copy of it. It was really good to get back that polymerization back when Sabretooth was a mad focus of the deck. Now it's just kind of not needed, and Rabbit was never really like a super crucial part of the deck, except for like when it first came out. Fluffal Mouse says during your main phase you can special up to 2 copies of Mouse from your deck, literally just for going into Tiger. That was its whole purpose from like the anime and shit, and it never really came up anyway, because why the fuck are you relying on hard drawing 1 mouse and then having to keep the other 2 in the deck? That's stupid. Patchwork Fluffal, I think, was at a Soul Fusion. It's always treated as a Fright Fur, and it can be a substitute for any Fright Fur as long as the other material is correct. There's really no super big point in it, except for like being an extra copy of Sabers, in which just grab the Sabers at that point. It was one of the many cards that was supposed to be used to go into Fright for Chimera, but Fright for Chimera is dog shit. Dangerous Fright for Nightmare is a card that pisses me off so much, and if you really want to hear all the reasons why I don't like this card, especially compared to what it was in the manga, I actually have like a 10-minute rant video back from this channel, was very fresh, where I just completely shit on this card. It was really funny. Fright for Daredevil says if it destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can burn your opponent for 500, and then if this card leaves by battle or an opponent's card effect while on the field, you can burn your opponent for 500 for each Fright from your graveyard. It's just big body, big burn, burn, burn. Not really super important in today's day and age, but it was a really good target for being a 3k generic Fright Fur. Sabretooth, my beloved. I feel so bad for not playing it anymore because this was like the most important card for the longest time. But Sabretooth is a level 8 that says it requires a Fright Fur fusion and then 1 or more Fluffal and or Edgeums. It says on fusion summon you can target a Fright Fur in your graveyard and special summon it, and all Fright Fur monsters you control gain 400 attack, and also if it was fusion summon using 3 or more materials, it cannot be destroyed by battle or card effects. This card was like the bread and butter of Fluffal for the longest time, especially with the Fright Fur monster we're about to mention in a second, which would be a perfect OTK with it. So Sabretooth would juice itself and all your other Fright Furs by 400. The thing you used to fuse into it, you would just immediately summon back, so you got the Sabretooth for free, and the protection was massive, especially if you fused off something like the cat or the penguin or something that would also give you value, so that using the multiple materials wasn't a big deal, and so you could just do some massive damage with Sabretooth, especially in combination with one of the strongest cards in the entire archetype that you just don't really have the space for anymore, Fright for Kraken. Kraken was probably their very first super generic one, I think. It requires an Edgeum and a Fluffal. It has 2200 attack, 3000 defense. Once per turn, you can target a monster your opponent controls and send it to the graveyard, and it cannot attack directly the turn the effect is activated, but it can attack twice during each battle phase, and once per turn at the end of the battle phase if it battled, you can change it to defense. Like, kind of like Dante, but it's not like a mandatory. Kraken is so awesome. I love this card so much. It was one of my favorite cards I ever played in any deck, and also when I pulled it out of a pack that I admittedly stole from Walmart, I could not stop myself from like internally screaming super loud. This card was so awesome to have. It was so strong. You really only don't play it now because you just don't have the space and you can just play the whale instead for a quick removal. But this card was everything back in the day, especially in combination with the Sabretooth. The 2600 double attack plus the 2800 Sabretooth was exactly enough for game if you didn't have to use Kraken's effect to remove a card. And so Kraken was just massive. You could just punch twice. If you didn't kill somehow, put it in defense, big 3k body, super, super cool. Love Kraken to bits. Wish I had more space to play it again. Fright for Leo is everything about Kraken, but worse. Moving on. Fright for Bear is the very first Fright for monster alongside Fright for Wolf, which we will get to because everything's kind of split up a bit wonky. And it sucks, and it especially sucked for the time because it literally just did not work against pendulums, which I guess was like the purpose. I think they showed that in the anime, like, oh, my pendulums don't go to the graveyard, you can't steal them with Bear, oh no. But yeah, it kind of just completely defeats the purpose when you try to print it like that in real life, so I guess it was just their way of really pushing pendulums. Also, this card's supposed to be in the next section because there actually is 2 pages of this that I will mention. But Fenrir is actually not a horrible card in the deck if you have the space for it. It's a free earth, big body with removal in the main deck, forces your opponent to interact with it. You can use its effect to bait out disruptions, and you can use it to search for another Fenrir for discard fodder. Not a bad card at all. Moving on, we have 16 more Fluffal and Frightfur and Edgem cards to talk about because, wow, Fluffal struggled from the Arc 5 syndrome of getting a bunch of support cards, and most of them sucked. Edgem Tomahawk is a level 4 fiend that says you can send an Edgem from your hand to the graveyard to bring your opponent for 800, and you can send an Edgem from your deck to the graveyard to copy its name. So you're supposed to send Chain from hand and burn for 800 and then search off Chain and then send Sabers from your deck in order to copy its name. But there's really no purpose, especially because you'd rather not put your Edgems on board most of the time, so Tomahawk's artwork, while cool, is not enough to save it from being a mid card. Frightfur Wolf came out alongside Frightfur Bear as the first Frightfur monsters for the deck, and it's just infinitely better because it requires Sabers and one or more Fluffals with 2000 attack, and, well, sorry, the Fluffals don't have to have 2000 attack, he has 2000 attack, but he must be fusion summoned with Depot materials, cannot be special summoned by other ways, can't summon off of Sabertooth, which doesn't really matter, but it can attack up to the number of materials used for its summon, so bare minimum twice, but most of the time when you did play Wolf, I was probably one of the last people to actually play Wolf, because I thought it was, like, super cool to have, especially in combination with Tiger, if you could go Poly into Tiger, Frightfur Fusion into Wolf. So you would just fuse like Sabers and a shit ton of materials into Wolf and then swing for like 8 billion attack, and it was really fun, but with its low attack stat, unless you had something like Tiger or Sabertooth along with it, it was a little bit unreliable, which is no wonder why a lot of people ended up cutting it after it ended up getting like kind of power crept by other Fluffal monsters. You know, Frightfur Kraken just kind of completely wiped this card off the face of the earth, but I still think it's really cool. Frightfur Sheep I did mention earlier for the zoo format. 2k body, requires Chain and a Fluffal. If it battles, that has the Armades effect, and if it's destroyed by battle and sent to the grave, or if it's destroyed by an opponent's card effect and sent to the grave, you can special it and then make it gain 800 attack, which does not stack, by the way, trust me. I did that in middle school. I was a menace. I got this thing up to like 7,000. Not how that works. It'll go no higher than 2,800, but still pretty cool against Dryden effects, but really there's not much of a reason to play it anymore. Frightfur Reborn is just a monster reborn for Frightfurs, but also you can banish it from the grave to add a banish Fluffal or Frightfur back to the graveyard. Honestly, Octo just kind of does what this does, but better most of the time, and you don't really need to reborn your Frightfurs. If you do, just play Monster Reborn, though I guess this does have a graveyard effect in case Toy Vendor gets rid of it. Suture Rebirth is a Monster Reborn for a Fluffal or Frightfur, but its effects are negated. Not really a super necessary card. One of my first cards for the deck, though, which is really cool. Fluffal Crane is a trap card, so that's really most of the thing you need to hear about it. But it says when a Fluffal is destroyed by attacker card effects and sent to the graveyard, you can add it to your hand and draw a card, which was good back in middle school format, not so good in modern format. Designer Frightfur summons an Edgimp or a Fluffal in graveyard and treats it as a Frightfur for a fusion summon. Not even the worst thing ever, but it'd be better on a spell. Edgimp Cotton Eater, I believe, came out in Soul Fusion. All fusions you control gain 300 attack. Once per turn, if a Frightfur fusion summoned to your field, you can draw a card, or fusion summon to your field, sorry. And if it's special summon, you can burn your opponent for 200 for each Frightfur in your grave. Don't know why this card exists. It has a cool name and artwork, but it's not really viable enough. I know some people were playing it and they were like living and breathing by this card, but I think it was so bad. Edgimp Frightfloid is always treated as a Frightfur. I'm not even going to acknowledge the second effect because that was the only reason you would ever play this card, was because it was supposed to go into Frightfur Chimera, which was supposed to be their super big crazy boss monster. But considering that it requires 3 Frightfur monsters and only had 2800 attack, why would you do that? It says it must be fusion summoned and cannot be summoned by other ways. If it battles, your opponent cannot activate cards or effects until the end of the damage step. When it destroys an opponent's monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, you can special that monster to your field, but its attack is halved. You can only use this effect once per turn. But also it gains 300 attack for each monster you control that is owned by your opponent. So basically, you're spending 3 Frightfur monsters for a mediocre Go-Yo Guardian, when you would much rather just use the fusion monsters that you use to go into this. Yeah, you're supposed to use things like the Patrick Fluffal and the Edgimp Frightfuloid, but why would you do that is the big thing. Why would you break your deck with these bad cards to summon this? It's super disappointing too, because this and Bear, the 2 worst Frightfur monsters, are the ones that got ultis, which really pisses me off, but at least I have them. At least I have the Chimera. I don't remember if I have Bear yet or not. But, I mean, at least it looks cool as an ultimate rare. I do like Chimera's artwork, but wow, it just really sucks how ass this card is. Toy Parade kind of just vaguely works on Frightfur monsters. Frightfur Sanctuary literally says you have to discard a card and send 2 Frightfurs from your extra deck to fucking use it. And also, all fusions are treated as Frightfur monsters. If it's sent to the graveyard, you can target a Frightfur in your grave and return it to the extra deck. this card's even worse than just playing the Frightfuloids and shit. I don't know why you would do that. So you're already getting rid of your Fright first to make Chimera, which is bad enough, but now they want you to get rid of cards like Dragostapelia or other fusions you control to make your Chimera. Why would you do that? And the maintenance cost is so dog shit. I keep forgetting how horrible this card is, which sucks because the artwork is awesome, but this would have been so much better on a field spell with actually good effects. Moving on to like a not dog shit card, we have Fright for Factory that allows you to banish a poly or fusion spell from your graveyard to essentially treat it as an extra copy of Polymerization on field for a Fright Fur. Also, it's sent to the graveyard. You can target one of your banished Fright for Fusion and add it to your hand. I actually played the fuck out of this card as a kid. I played like 1 or 2 copies. It was actually really, really strong because you got multiple uses out of your polys and your fusion spells, such as Fusion Deployment, I think I was playing back then. I don't think you play it in the deck now, considering you want to make links and stuff, but I was playing Deployment back then. And most of the time, you would be using it on one of your copies of Fright for Fusion. You played like 2 back then. So you banish it, and then if this card's sent to the graveyard, including by your Tiger, which is really cool, you can add back the Fright for Fusion, use it again. I was doing some mad combos with this card. You kind of just don't need it in Modern Fluffal anymore. You have plenty of ways to fusion summon for the very few times you do fuse, but I think that this is by far one of like the least bad cards out of these ones, especially after going from like Fluffal Crane all the way to here. This card is actually serviceable. Fusion Fright Waltz is an anime reference that I'm not even gonna read. Fright for Vendor is supposed to be treated as toy vendors. You have another way to go into have a toy vendor, I guess. Also, it's called Fright for Jar, actually, by the way. Vendor is the old translation. But instead of being like a Fluffal thing where it gets you advantage, you have to see an Edge Imp off the top, and then you get to pop a card, and it says otherwise place a card from your hand on the top or the bottom of the deck. I think I'd rather discard. Oh wait, it already makes you discard a card, yeah. So I mean, I still would rather probably discard the card that I drew because that's one of the good things about Toy Vendor. But also, as sent to the graveyard, you can target a face-up monster your opponent controls and have its attack. I thought it was all monsters, actually. This card's even worse than I thought. But yeah, there's no real reason to play this. Maybe if it was a spell, you'd play a 1-up for the funny, but you really do not need this card. And then finally, Fright for March is a counter trap, actually, with some sick-ass artwork. That says, when an opponent's spell or trap card or monster effect is activated that targets a Fright Fur you control, negate the activation, and if you do destroy that card, then you can send one of the targeted Fright Furs to the grave and special a level 8 or higher Fright Fur fusion from your extra deck, treat it as a fusion summon, but during your next end phase, banish the monster special by this effect. This card would actually be really, really good if it didn't specify that it has to target a Fright for Fusion monster, or a Fright for monster, period. If it was just an Infernity Barrier in general, I would absolutely play one of this card, because it does like a lot of really cool stuff, especially in Modern Fluffal, where you have things like Whale that get that pop on Fusion Summon without requiring a material. You could easily just like march away your first Whale or a Tiger or something after you I'd get Infernity Barriered or something, and then you can just tag out into the Whale, have Whale pop some cards, and then you can just protect it with like the Scythe or whatever, and then next turn, you'll more than likely have enough ways to kill your opponent before the banish matters. This would be insane if that was the case, but unfortunately, it does specify that it has to be a targeting card, and so this card's just completely power crept. I don't even remember if it was played back then when it first came out, which, again, is really unfortunate because I really fuck with this card's art. Okay, that was a lot of talking. Thank God I get a break now because I'm gonna go ahead and get into some replays that I got on stream, and these are actually some pretty solid replays compared to my last few Sleeper Sundays, so I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you after they're done. Well, that was shorter than I thought, but it was nice while it lasted. So I hope you did enjoy the replays. I do have the full unedited VOD if you weren't able to make it to the stream. Super fun to get. I actually had a massive blast compared to the Winwich one, at least. I know that Numeron one wasn't really so much of a game as it was a one-sided ass whooping, but I just wanted to show off how insane this deck can pop off. That was basically one of, if not the most ideal Fluffal end board you can make in the combo line and everything with like the Golden Lord and everything like that. Basically, that was just what Fluffal can do. That being said, let's go ahead and get into the strengths. The biggest strength of the deck being by far the amount of soft once per turns you can abuse in the archetype. Between Penguin, both effects of Toy Vendor, Whale, and Sheep's Inherent Summon, you can easily abuse these in order to amass a powerful end board and bait disruptions when you have extenders. Speaking of, the lack of restrictions in most of the good cards of the archetype allow you plenty of freedom to dabble outside of your fusion boundaries, making strong end pieces like IP and Appaloosa, but also still being able to utilize strong fusions like Dragon's Stapelia and Garden Chimera outside of your archetype. Also, the board breaking potential of this archetype is massive. Most of the Frightfur monsters, even the ones you don't play anymore like Kraken or Leo, have some pretty damn strong removal. Whale is either a free pop minimum or a plus due to popping Toy Vendor, and Tiger alone can just completely decimate an entire field, leaving your opponent wide open for your attacks. This fares perfectly with Tiger stat boost, which helps your already aggressive deck go for the throw even easier. Finally, the resource game of the deck can actually go a long way. Looping back to the lack of certain restrictions, Toy Vendor alone can end up being looped so many times that you end up with Fluffals you don't even need in your hand half the time. And Penguin, Guardian Chimera, Foolish Goods, Dog, and of course the absurd Wings can just overload you with enough advantage to make Tier Limit blush sometimes. You even have some pretty damn solid follow-up and recursion, from Repair to Octopus to even Golden Lord at times. That being said, for every strength there is at least one weakness. Starting off,
Droll and Lockbird.
Jokes aside, the deck does seriously have a massive amount of problems under certain floodgates, especially hand traps. Droll and Shifter are just absolutely insane cards against the deck, and even non-hand trap floodgates can be nasty. Outside of Golden Lord, for example, outing something like Skill Drain can be extra nasty, and God forbid, like you saw in the Ice Barrier matchup, you have to deal with something like an anti-spell. Like, if that was anything but a Warlock, like if it was just straight up anti-spell, I would have exploded. Furthermore, as insane as your board breaking can be, going second can be pretty rough. With so much engine in the deck, you have little room for non-engine such as hand traps and board breakers, so a lot of games can end up relying hard on the die roll and you being able to go first. And despite the powerful cards like Wings, Toy Vendor, and Penguin, the deck can end up actually being pretty clunky at times. A lot of plays rely on either a really good starting hand or some cracked RNG off of your draws, even resolving the full Bear and Wings combo like Pitch Bear, grab Toy Vendor, pitch Wings, get the draw 2 search. That might not even be enough to get you going if you just end up drawing like I don't know, like a Dog after using your normal summon, Goods after using it already, and then like a Herald of Orange Light or a Frightfur Repair. And this is especially bad when these strong cards like Wings get hit with a hand trap or something. Speaking of which, Wings targeting the grave especially sucks, since it becomes vulnerable to Ghost Bell and things like DD Crow now. So how are we making Fluffal better? Well, I actually think it's not even that hard. First, I think one of the biggest elements in the room I'd like to discuss for Fluffal as a whole would be some going first pieces. The deck has massive board breaking and OTK potential if you can get into it, but in Archetype has really nothing to go first with aside from Scythe and Whale. I think a new boss monster for the collection, preferably with some generic materials with some kind of quick effect removal, would be really cool. I don't want to give it like a negate or anything because that'd just be too cheesy and generic and no one would really like that, but removal would be in theme for the archetype while still being strong at going first. This also means that a more pure Fluffal variant, such as the old school Fusion OTK Beatdown variant, would be more viable and you could do more with hands of just fusion materials instead of having to rely on link spam. Next, a new consistency piece would also be pretty sick, and I think it would combo well with protection from disruption too. As played out as it is, a field spell that can search on activation, maybe you can dump a Fluffal to add an edge imp or vice versa, for some setup, but also having like targeting protection for Fluffals would be really cool. This isn't as broken as something like the Tenpai or Gimmick Puppet field spells, even if it is similar, but it still helps the deck's consistency by adding 4 more searches to the deck along with terraforming, and also helping you push through some of the more difficult disruptions to deal with, such as Imperm, Veiler, and targeting spot removal, especially on cards like Penguin and Dolphin, because they aren't on summon. Also, looping back to the fusion monster, by the way, it isn't like super necessary, but another in-archetype fusion spell would be really cool. Something that isn't a miracle fusion, but like also it wouldn't be searchable off of Patchwork or anything, you know, but just something like that could be good off of Chain, I don't know. And finally, what's that? The deck's already kind of good enough, so there's not really much left to do to the actual archetype. Well, fine then, alright. The final way to make the deck better, of course, is then
Band roll and dimension shift.
But alright then, with that being said, I don't think there's too much else I can say about Fluffal as a deck other than I really, really love this deck. This was my very first deck that I ever, like, completed physically as, like, a whole deck instead of just, like, a bunch of playground bulk. And I actually spent so long putting this deck together. I felt like an anime character, you know, just getting more and more cards. I remember one time I got, like, a big stack of bulk from a friend, like, that didn't actually play the game, but he had a bunch of cards he wanted to give away. And they ended up having, like, half of it being Fluffal cards, like the Suture Rebirths and the Trap cards and shit, and I was like, oh my god, this is so cool. I just felt so cool. And then I discovered eBay, and so that was even more fun. I was just buying so much Fluffal stuff, and it was one of the first decks I ended up doing, like, okay with at a tournament. I think, I think it was my second tournament, because my very first one I don't really count too much because it was a very, very small one, but my second tournament I actually got top 4 with it back then, which was really, really fun, and so I just have a really big soft spot in my heart for this deck. But with that being said, that's going to do it for the video. If you liked it, please sure to leave a like, as I'll split this video and the channel into the YouTube recommended, and if there's content where someone like it, like the rest of my Sleeper Sunday series, I do want to try and keep up on this again, despite my, like, quote-unquote break from the game, then perhaps consider subscribing and turning on notifications if you haven't already. Plus, it supports the channel or anything else, and it's absolutely free. And do remember that every month I will be posting the Sleeper Sunday poll to actually vote to see which deck will be in the next video. I usually will have a list of 4 options, and the poll will only be up for 24 hours, so turning on notifications is very, very important in case you don't want to miss your vote. Also, if you want to support Sleeper Sunday options, you can always check out the Patreon as well. I do have a $1 and $5 tier. The $5 tier is able to suggest decks for the polls for Sleeper Sunday, so that there's a bit more of like a community aspect to it, of what people want to see. If you want to support me financially in another way, then be sure to check out Tapioca's link down below. Use code Aurora5 for 5% off your purchase at checkout and to support me financially. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.